The Anzio Landing, January-May 1944. An amphibious operation designed to outflank German defenses and quickly capture Rome. Instead, it became a 4-month siege where 40,000 Allied troops were trapped on a tiny beachhead under constant German artillery fire in one of the bloodiest stalemates of the Italian campaign.
Welcome back, everyone. Today, I want to tell you about one of the most controversial operations of World War II. An operation that was supposed to be a brilliant end run around German defenses, a quick strike that would capture Rome and end the Italian campaign. Instead, it turned into months of bloody stalemate on a tiny beachhead where American and British soldiers were trapped, bombarded constantly, and dying by the thousands. This is the story of Operation Shingle, the Anzio Landing of January 1944. To understand Anzio, you need to understand the situation in Italy in late 1943. The Allies had invaded Italy in September 1943. Everyone thought it would be easy. Italy had surrendered, the Germans would retreat, and the Allies would march straight up the Italian peninsula to capture Rome and then push into northern Italy and beyond. But it didn't work out that way. The Germans didn't retreat. Instead, they dug in and fought for every mile. Italy's terrain was a defender's dream: mountains, rivers, narrow valleys, and the Germans used it all brilliantly. They built defensive lines across the peninsula, forcing the Allies to attack uphill against prepared positions. By December 1943, the Allied advance had stalled at the Gustav Line, a German defensive position that stretched across Italy from coast to coast. The key position in that line was Monte Cassino, an ancient monastery sitting on top of a mountain that dominated the entire valley. The Germans had turned it into a fortress. American and British forces had been battering themselves against the Gustav Line for weeks, making almost no progress and taking heavy casualties. The Allied commanders were frustrated. General Mark Clark, commanding the U.S. Fifth Army, was under pressure to take Rome. British Prime Minister Churchill wanted action, wanted victories to show the folks back home. The Italian campaign was supposed to be over by now, but instead it had turned into a grinding war of attrition. So they came up with a plan. If they couldn't break through the Gustav Line by frontal assault, they'd go around it. They'd conduct an amphibious landing behind German lines at a small port town called Anzio, about 30 miles south of Rome. The landing force would race inland, cut the German supply lines, maybe even capture Rome before the Germans knew what hit them. The Germans would be forced to retreat from the Gustav Line or risk being cut off. It was brilliant, at least on paper. The landing was scheduled for January 22, 1944. The force would be commanded by Major General John Lucas, a cautious, methodical officer who'd served in World War I. Under him would be the U.S. 6th Corps, the 3rd Infantry Division, the 45th Infantry Division, elements of the 1st Armored Division, plus British units, including the 1st Division and commandos. About 40,000 men in the initial landing, with more to follow.
General Lucas wasn't enthusiastic about the operation. He thought it was too risky. The landing site was over 60 miles behind German lines. If things went wrong, if the Germans reacted faster than expected, the landing force could be cut off and destroyed. Lucas wrote in his diary, "This whole affair has a strong odor of disaster about it." But orders were orders. On January 22, 1944, the invasion fleet approached Anzio in the early morning darkness. American and British soldiers climbed down cargo nets into landing craft, just like they'd done at Sicily and Salerno. They expected fierce resistance. The Germans had fought hard at every previous landing. But when the first waves hit the beaches at Anzio, there was almost no resistance. A few scattered shots, some mines, but no major German forces. The landing was virtually unopposed. By midday, 36,000 men and 3,000 vehicles were ashore. The Allies had achieved complete tactical surprise. Private First Class Felix Sparks, from Arizona, landing with the 3rd Infantry Division, later recalled, "We couldn't believe it. We'd prepared for another bloodbath like Salerno, but the beach was almost empty. We just walked ashore. It seemed too easy." And it was. Here's where the controversy begins. General Lucas had his entire corps ashore. The Germans were surprised and unprepared, and the road to Rome lay open. Some officers urged him to push inland immediately, to exploit the surprise, to race for Rome before the Germans could react. But Lucas was cautious. He'd been told to establish a secure beachhead first. He was worried about German counterattacks. He wanted to build up supplies, bring more troops ashore, consolidate his position before advancing. So instead of pushing inland, the Allied forces spent the next few days digging in around Anzio, fortifying the beachhead. And that gave the Germans time to react. And react they did. Field Marshal Albert Kesselring, the German commander in Italy, was one of the best defensive commanders in the German army. When he heard about the Anzio Landing, he immediately understood the danger. If the Allies pushed inland, they could cut off the entire German army in southern Italy. He had to contain that beachhead immediately. Kesselring pulled units from across Italy and even from other theaters. He grabbed whatever forces he could find: infantry divisions, tank battalions, artillery units, even training units and headquarters personnel. Within 48 hours, he had German forces moving toward Anzio from every direction. Within a week, he had 8 divisions surrounding the beachhead.
The Allies had missed their chance. By the time Lucas ordered the advance inland on January 30th, it was too late. The Germans had formed a solid defensive ring around the beachhead. When American forces tried to push out, they ran into heavy resistance. The advance stalled after just a few miles. And then the Germans counterattacked. Hitler himself ordered Kesselring to drive the Allies back into the sea, to turn Anzio into another Dunkirk. The Germans threw everything they had at the beachhead. What followed was 4 months of some of the most brutal fighting American soldiers faced in World War II. The Anzio beachhead was only about 7 miles deep and 15 miles wide, a tiny piece of Italian coastline packed with 70,000 Allied troops. And the Germans surrounded it completely, sitting on the hills overlooking the flat coastal plain, with clear views of everything happening in the beachhead. The German artillery was murderous. Every square yard of the beachhead was within range of German guns. The Germans could see everything, every movement, every concentration of troops, every supply dump, and they shelled it constantly, day and night, for 4 months. Sergeant Audie Murphy from Texas, who would become America's most decorated soldier of the war, described Anzio, "We called it Hell's Half-Acre. The shelling never stopped. You couldn't move during the day without drawing fire. At night, the Germans would send up flares and catch you in the open. We lived in foxholes, ate in foxholes, slept in foxholes. If you stood up, you were asking to get killed." There was nowhere safe in the beachhead. The rear areas, where headquarters and hospitals were supposed to be secure, were under fire constantly. Nurses in the evacuation hospitals worked under bombardment. Supply troops unloading ships at the harbor were hit by artillery. Even the beaches weren't safe. German shells fell on the landing areas. The soldiers learned to dig deep. They dug elaborate foxholes in bunkers, some 6 or 8 feet deep, covered with logs and sandbags. They lived underground like moles. When they had to move, they moved fast and low, always watching for the telltale puff of smoke from German artillery positions on the hills. Private First Class Jack Wilson from Pennsylvania wrote home, "Mom, you asked me what it's like here.
Imagine living in a grave that you dug yourself. That's what our foxholes are, graves we live in. The Germans are trying to make them permanent graves. We are trying to stay alive until we can get out of here.
The Germans didn't just use artillery. They had the Anzio Landing railroad guns that fired massive shells from miles away. You couldn't hear them coming. The first warning was the explosion. Those shells could destroy an entire building, create craters 20 feet across. The psychological effect was enormous. You never knew when or where they'd hit. The Germans also conducted ground attacks, trying to push the Allies back into the sea. In mid-February, they launched a major offensive, throwing 7 divisions at the beachhead. For several days, it looked like they might succeed. German tanks and infantry broke through the Allied lines in several places. Some German units got within a mile of the beach. The fighting was desperate. American artillery fired constantly, often at point-blank range. Tank destroyers engaged German panzers at ranges of a few hundred yards. Infantry fought with rifles, machine guns, grenades, and sometimes hand-to-hand. The line held, but barely. Lieutenant Colonel Jack Toffee, commanding a battalion of the 3rd Infantry Division, described the fighting. "We threw everything we had at them. Artillery, mortars, machine guns, rifles. We fired until the barrels glowed red. The Germans kept coming. We'd stop one attack and another would hit us. It went on for days. We held because we had nowhere to retreat to. If we broke, we'd be driven into the sea." The casualties were staggering. In 4 months at Anzio, the Allies suffered over 43,000 casualties, killed, wounded, missing, or captured. That's more than half the total number of troops who'd landed. Some units were nearly wiped out. The 3rd Infantry Division, which bore the brunt of much of the fighting, suffered over 50% casualties. And it wasn't just combat casualties. The conditions in the beachhead caused thousands of non-combat casualties too. Trench foot from constant exposure to mud and water, combat fatigue from months of continuous bombardment, disease from the unsanitary conditions. The beachhead was a breeding ground for illness. The medics and doctors worked miracles. The evacuation hospitals at Anzio were some of the busiest in the entire war. Surgeons operated round the clock, often under artillery fire. Nurses cared for the wounded in underground bunkers with shells exploding overhead. The medical personnel at Anzio received numerous decorations for valor. They earned them. First Lieutenant Mary Roberts, an Army nurse from Ohio, wrote in her diary, "The wounded keep coming. We work 12-hour shifts, sometimes longer. The hospital is hit almost daily. We've had nurses and doctors killed. But we keep working. These boys need us. They're fighting and dying out there. The least we can do is try to save as many as we can."
Supply was another constant challenge. Everything had to come in by sea: food, ammunition, medical supplies, fuel. Everything. The Germans bombed the harbor constantly. German artillery shelled the beaches. Unloading ships was a dangerous job. Supply troops worked frantically to get supplies off the ships before the German artillery found the range. Food was monotonous, mostly C rations and K rations. Hot meals were rare. Water was rationed. Ammunition was precious. Soldiers learned to make every shot count. There was never enough of anything. Despite all this, the soldiers held. They held through January, through February, through March, into April. They held because they had no choice, because retreat wasn't an option, because their only way out was forward. The situation finally broke in late May 1944. The Allies had been attacking the Gustav Line continuously, and finally they broke through at Monte Cassino. With the Gustav Line broken, the way was open for the forces at Anzio to break out. On May 23, 1944, 4 months after landing,
The Allied forces at Anzio launched their breakout offensive. They attacked the German lines surrounding the beachhead with everything they had. This time, they had the momentum. The Germans, worn down by months of fighting and now facing Allied breakthroughs in other sectors, couldn't hold. The breakout succeeded. Allied forces from Anzio linked up with Allied forces pushing up from the south. The beachhead that had been a trap for 4 months suddenly became a springboard. The Germans were forced to retreat. Rome fell on June 4, 1944. But the victory was bittersweet. Yes, they'd taken Rome. Yes, they'd broken out of Anzio. But at what cost? Over 43,000 Allied casualties for a beachhead that was supposed to be a quick strike. 4 months of hell for an operation that was supposed to take days. The debate over Anzio continues to this day. Was it a strategic success because it eventually led to the capture of Rome? Or was it a strategic failure because it took so long and cost so much? Was General Lucas right to be cautious? Or should he have pushed inland immediately when he had the chance? Winston Churchill, who'd been one of the main advocates for the Anzio operation, later said, "I had hoped we were hurling a wildcat onto the shore, but all we got was a stranded whale." General Lucas was relieved of command in February, replaced by General Lucian Truscott. But Truscott faced the same problems. A beachhead under constant fire, with nowhere to go. The problem wasn't the commanders. The problem was that once the element of surprise was lost, Anzio became a death trap.
For the soldiers who fought there, Anzio was simply hell. It was months of constant danger, constant bombardment, constant fear. It was living in a foxhole, never knowing if the next shell had your name on it. It was watching friends die and wondering if you'd be next. But they held. Through all of it, they held. American soldiers, British soldiers, fighting side by side on that tiny beachhead, holding against everything the Germans could throw at them. They held because that's what soldiers do. They hold the line. They do their duty. They don't quit. Private First Class Peter Visco from New York, who landed at Anzio in January and survived until the breakout in May, later said, "People ask me what Anzio was like. I tell them it was 4 months in hell. But we came out of it. We survived. And we won. That's all that matters in the end. We won." The soldiers who fought at Anzio didn't get the glory of D-Day or the fame of the Battle of the Bulge. Anzio was overshadowed by other operations, other battles. But for those who were there, Anzio was their defining experience. It was where they learned that they could endure anything, survive anything, if they stuck together. Today, if you visit Anzio, there's a large American military cemetery there. Nearly 8,000 American soldiers are buried there. Soldiers who died in the Anzio campaign and in other operations in Italy. Row after row of white crosses, looking out over the blue Mediterranean. It's a peaceful place now. Hard to imagine that 80 years ago it was one of the most dangerous places on Earth. There's also a memorial on the beach where the Americans landed. It marks the spot where thousands of American soldiers came ashore on that January morning in 1944, expecting a tough fight, but finding an empty beach. It reminds visitors of the opportunity that was there, briefly, before the trap closed. The veterans of Anzio formed an association after the war. They held reunions, told their stories, made sure the world remembered what happened on that beachhead. As they grew older, fewer attended each year. Now, nearly all of them are gone. But their story remains.
Anzio teaches us several lessons. It teaches us that bold plans don't always work out as expected, that surprise is a fleeting advantage that must be exploited immediately, that terrain and enemy capabilities matter enormously, that even when everything goes wrong, soldiers will hold the line if given leadership and support. But most importantly, Anzio reminds us of the courage and endurance of the American soldier.
stuck on a beachhead under constant fire for 4 months, no way out except through the enemy. Limited supplies, heavy casualties, brutal conditions. And yet they held. They did their job. They accomplished the mission, even though it took much longer and cost much more than anyone expected. That's the story of Anzio. Not the quick victory that was planned, but the long, grinding battle that actually happened. Not the glory that was hoped for, but the grim determination that was required. Not an easy triumph, but a hard-won survival. The men who fought at Anzio, the infantrymen in their foxholes, the tankers in their Shermans, the artillerymen firing their guns, the medics treating the wounded, the engineers maintaining the roads, the supply troops unloading the ships, they all deserve to be remembered. They went through hell and came out the other side. They held the beachhead. They broke out when the time came. They won. Thank you for listening, and never forget what those soldiers endured on that small beachhead in Italy from January to May 1944. Never forget Anzio.
In just 4 months on the Anzio beachhead, over 43,000 Allied soldiers were killed, wounded, missing, or captured. Thousands more suffered from disease, frostbite, and the unending strain of constant bombardment. Entire units were nearly wiped out. Families back home lost sons, brothers, and fathers. War is hell. There is no glory in it. It devours lives, shatters bodies, and crushes souls. Those who start it, those who send men to die for their ambitions, are cowards, blind to the human cost, and may God judge them. Yet even in the darkest hell of Anzio, courage endured. Soldiers clung to life, to each other, and to hope. They fought not for glory, not for medals, but because they could not quit, because doing nothing was not an option, because humanity, even in the midst of horror, can shine through. Never forget the battered bastards of Anzio. Never forget what they endured. Never forget the lives stolen, the bodies broken, and the price of human conflict. War is a curse, and its victims deserve our memory, respect, and tears.